look at the amendment process. So what this means is we're going to look at how and why the Constitution can be formally changed. So the actual text can be changed and added to, but we're also going to look at how it's gone under change in the past. This is going to include both formal amendments and ways that we can informally change the Constitution. So with formal changes to the Constitution, thinking back to our founding fathers, if you spent all this time working on this document, making it perfect, using these ideas that you had gained from other areas, from other countries, from other documents, you thought you were creating this really perfect document, and they wanted it to be possible for the Constitution to be changed, right? So the document could grow with the new country that was being developed, but they didn't want it to be common. So thinking about their kind of strain of logic there, if change was too easy, if it was too common to change the Constitution, it really could change the integrity of the document quite quickly. So they wanted it to be possible, but you were going to have to work for it a little bit. So there have been 27 occurrences of change to our Constitution throughout history. So if you kind of play that out over the number of years that the United States has been a country, that's really not too many. So we'll learn about the specifics. But the first 10 actually are from the Bill of Rights. So if we think back to our Federalists and Anti-Federalists, remember the Anti-Federalists were really pushing for this Bill of Rights in order to protect individual liberties and rights. So that was the first 10 changes, got added pretty quickly right after the ratification process was beginning. So our Anti-Federalists are responsible for those first 10, and then the remaining 17 have occurred ever since. So it does follow a set procedure that is outlined in the Constitution. So the Constitution was designed as a living document, so the process for change was illustrated in the document itself. Remember, that was something that they wanted to change and make a little bit easier. They learned from their Articles of Confederation experience. So the procedure to change the Constitution, like we said, is a little bit slow. It's difficult. They didn't want to make it too easy. So there are kind of two options, right? They have two paths they could possibly take. The first path includes changes both at the federal and the state level. And this is actually an example of federalism, which we are going to cover in our next unit. But what that basically means is that there's cooperation between the national level of government and the state level. Remember, we talked about that when we were talking about our different types of government. A federal government includes cooperation and a sharing of power. So there is a big power sharing in this process. So option one, the proposal process occurs with a 2/3 vote of Congress for the House and the Senate. So there has to be a 2/3 vote to adopt this change at a national level in our Congress. Then it goes down to the ratification. So once the amendment is approved by Congress, it will head down to the state legislatures. And there has to be a 3/4 vote of the state legislatures at that level in order to ratify or in order to formally adopt that amendment. So that's option one. Option two includes a 2/3 vote of Congress, right? So 2/3 vote of Congress occurs pretty much no matter what. We can see here both of our options, right? Both of the paths that we can take to adopting an amendment start with Congress. And then the ratification process is a little bit different. So even though it is still at a state level, what states can choose to do is they can draw special state conventions. So these will be amendment ratification conventions, and they can create these in order to still pass it with a 3/4 vote, right? So a very solid majority, 75%. So again, we can see the cooperation that has to happen here, right? It's a both national and state level process. It's an example of federalism, which, as you're going to learn in our next unit, means that it's usually slow, right? So both of these things have to happen. So our founding fathers kind of got their wish. They wanted it to be possible, but not easy. So how do we change an amendment, right? So if we adopt an amendment and maybe, 50 years later, they're going, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Maybe it's not working, or we can make it better. So amendments can't be changed in the text, right? So you can't just kind of go back, erase statements and change it, adopt new statements. Amendments can only be changed by adopting other amendments. So you can only kind of add on top. So an example of this is prohibition. If you think back to 8th grade American history, I'm sure you learned about prohibition. So the 18th Amendment adopted this period of prohibition, which was the prohibiting of the distribution and sale of alcohol. So that happened, and then they were like, this isn't working out so well. So the 21st Amendment actually was adopted to repeal prohibition, right? So there's two of those 27 amendments that are dedicated to adding and then removing or repealing, right? So to repeal means to get rid of it, to remove it, repealing prohibitions. There are two amendments for that, and that is how we would change any of our previous amendments, is by adopting a new one. So there can also be informal changes to the Constitution, right? So not every change has to go through this amendment process, but as you'll see, they're a little bit easier to get rid of, right? It doesn't include a new amendment to get rid of that. There can be informal changes. So an informal change could be an action of Congress. So this we see a little bit in Article 3 of the Constitution, our judicial branch. It's pretty non-specific, right? It's a little bit vague. It doesn't create a lot of the state level courts. So many of those courts are actually created through laws that were passed after the Constitution. These courts were created through laws that are not denoted in the Constitution. So even though the Constitution kind of sets the precedent for these courts, the courts are not actually created within the Constitution. So it's a little bit vague in some places, and we supplement that with other laws. Another way that the Constitution can be kind of informally changed is through actions of the president, and this is called an executive order. So an executive order is an action by the president that he or she does not need approval from Congress for. So these executive orders can be undone by the next executive, and that makes them impermanent. So if a president issues an executive order, they are effective through that person's presidency, but they could be undone by the next executive, right? The next executive could slap another executive order down over that one like a Band-Aid and effectively undo the last president's executive order. So even though these changes can be made, right, it's not actually changing the document's text. It's just a way to kind of issue things similar to and around the Constitution without actually making changes through an amendment. Lastly, traditions and customs. So cabinets, term limits, political parties, these are all things that are not mentioned within the Constitution, but do kind of interrelate, and they're pretty integral to our country, and they interact with different things that are mentioned within the Constitution. So these things we'll learn about later in the year, but all of these things do kind of come within the bounds of the Constitution, but they're more informal. They're more based on tradition. So just to review, a little bit of a review here. How many amendments have been added to the Constitution? I want you to think about it now. And if you said 27, you are correct. It seems that you've learned something from this little activity. So now we are going to go ahead and learn about a little bit more about each of these amendments in specifics. I know you touched on them last class a little bit, but we are going to continue to learn about them and learn about the specific changes that they have made in this country. Thank you guys for listening. Great job.